rather than perpetuate that cycle of abuse into your children by villainizing the other parent. You do much bigger favor by giving your kid the life tools to be able to understand that people are not the sum total of the things they do or don't do, but they're a person of infinite worth. Their parent was someone that was lovable, that you loved enough to make the kid, and they may be struggling right now, but they're inherently valuable, and so are you. Welcome back to the living room. I'm Angela Jones, and I'm glad to have you here. Today, we're going to be talking about secrets, and it ought to be good. So Jake, when I brought this idea of talking about secrets, you were kind of like, what are you even talking about? Like, we're going to talk about, in fact, I think I wanted to name the podcast something having to do with secrets because of how insidious I think they are and how subtle I think they can come to exist in families and how absolutely destructive secrets can be. So I'm glad you give me the green light on talking about this stuff today.
Thanks for being willing to go there. I'm pumped to see where we're going to go with this. Yeah.
Well, the thing that really brought it, honestly, the reason I was pressing for it today in particular is I heard a story. I was reading a book over the weekend, and in this story, there was a little girl who had gone to church, and there was a guy, was a prophet, who saw her in his mind's eye, having prayed to God about, did he love her, that she needed to know, was asking God, do you really love me? And so the guy says to her, hey, I saw you, and did this happen? And the little girl was like, oh my gosh. And she ended up sharing that the reason she was praying like that was because her parents were going to be getting a divorce, and she was afraid that she caused it. And she wanted to know that even though she had caused her parents' divorce, that God was still going to love her. And so this was a family that attended church regularly. And this particular illustration was, essentially to show that, people who hear from God often do that as a means of bringing encouragement, to people. But what really struck me about it in particular is how often kids will internalize what's going on in their home with the grown-ups as being their fault, and that kids normally, like this little girl, kind of weirdly, got an avenue to talk about what was happening in her home. But how often is it that God taps a kid on the shoulder and says, hey, what's going on in your home that's making you feel afraid and scared and lonely and responsible? Because how's a little kid supposed to fix all that? If I'm a small child, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, my parents are fighting, my home is falling apart. I don't know what I did to cause it, but I think it's because of me. Where do you go back from there? Well, I'll tell you where you go back from there is you're 30 years old sitting in a shrink's office trying to figure out, why you feel the weight of the whole world on your shoulders because you can't even pin it back to that time. And so I think it's important for me to share with parents the impact of even those unintentional secrets that we cause our children to have to bear in homes where it's not this where there's conflict, because there's always conflict. There's conflicts in homes. That's normal. But where there's not avenues to address what kids are bearing in shame. And I think, to a large extent, we've all been there. I know I have been there for sure.
What is, so your heart on it is you want to help expose basically what family secrets do. What are some stories have you seen from other people? How has it affected the parents? How has it affected the kids? What are the damages that have come as a result of that?
Well, I mean, first let's talk about like how it impacts us as grown-ups. Okay. So I think, any person who's ever been in a couple has ended up having issues arise or fights arise. Let's just say, getting ready for company to come over, even if it's like couples game night, something like that, getting ready for couples to come over. And one of you says something that pisses the other one off. Next thing you know, you're in a fight. And ding dong, there's the front door. Well, guess what? Oh, hey, how are you? Yeah, come in. And people can feel that something's off, but you're not going to go there. You're not going to invite people in. Yeah, we're just really pissed off because, Jake didn't turn the oven on, and so the appetizers aren't ready, and we were supposed to have the appetizers ready, and they're supposed to be out, but here I am in the kitchen, not able to greet you. I mean, there's no good way to go with this, right? But what most people tend to do is they pretend like everything is fine, because, nobody wants to be around that couple who airs their dirty laundry all the time, right?
True.
Like, hey, you're going to go to one party at that house if that's what you find out. I mean, and again, I don't know if it's because we just don't know how to deal with conflict. I don't know if it's because if it gets to the point where it is spilling over like that, people intuitively realize there's a lot more under here, and it's not something I'm equipped to deal with, but I want to deal with. Hey, I got my own stuff at home. We were in a fight on the whole way over here, and I'm not trying to have your stuff pull up my stuff. This was not meant. We were just coming here to have some fun. You know what I mean? Give me another beer. So what most people do is they fake it. The couple who drove over in a fight, gonna fake it. The couple who got in a fight as they're getting ready for the party, gonna fake it. And we didn't come up with that strategy as grown-ups. We came up with that strategy because we saw how that was done when we were kids. People who were, I'll just say, overly authentic, or worse, dysregulated, didn't have any ability to control, what their public face was. Things were that bad that they no longer could control that public face. It had consequences. It had consequences of isolation. It had consequences of, maybe only drawing around those people who were really not a lot of fun to be around. And we adjust, we adapt to those things. And that stuff happens when we're kids. We pick that stuff up in our homes of origin. So, I know in my household, when I was growing up, there was a lot of fighting, but by the time, I don't know, I think by the time I was older, it was like an extended family type of, like everybody was it was a little bit on everywhere, so we had kind of a big family. My stepdad had a bigger family, and we spent most of our time with them. And so it was a little bit, chaos, a little bit of fussing, a little bit of fighting. And it was a little kind of let your stuff all hang out. Now, we didn't have a whole bunch of neighbors coming over and joining into all that, or extended, friends and what have you. It was just kind of more our culture. It was just, the hollering, would just happen. But it wasn't something you invited people into. You know what I mean? Now, we would sometimes go over to my Aunt Sandy and Uncle Fred's. There was a different kind of environment there. The kids, teenage kids, always had other kids coming over. There was always neighbors coming over. And, there was always an extra plate. There was always extra room for people. And they were, I think like more or less a happy and open family. Like I know that like they talked about what was going on, I can remember in particular, like my Uncle Fred actually just passed away this past weekend. He was a wonderful man. He really, really, it showed what it was like to be a loving spouse. Like my Aunt Sandy had some back issues that caused her to become addicted to painkillers at a earlier point in time, and very immobile. And he never ever like left her side, like not for a minute. But when we were kids, if there was an issue, like I remember one time, and this cousin has passed also, so I can tell the story without too much trouble, who he and his girlfriend had, got caught, in a compromised position in his room. And we didn't get all the gory details, but my uncle took them both out, and they had 5 acres, took them both out, and they walked and they talked about what had happened. It wasn't yelling. There wasn't shouting. There was a conversation. There were conversations around the real things that went on. And, we got to see that even if we didn't, everybody knew that they had gotten caught, in my cousin's bedroom, but we didn't know exactly what had gone on, but we did know that it got addressed. Like it wasn't hidden. The whole thing wasn't hidden. There wasn't shame around it. There was like, hey, and what I presume to have happened is like, hey, I get it. You're teenagers, you're interested in each other. That makes a lot of sense, but, I have urges. I don't indulge in every urge. Like, we teach this stuff to our kids when they're small. Like, for instance, I don't know about you, but like, often I'll have like odd urges, like to blurt things out. But because I'm a grown up, I've learned, you can't just blurt things out all the time, like especially in training situations. Like I'm in this mastermind that there was a person who was kind of like shouting out in the room, and the speaker ended up like just saying like, hey, like let's cut it out with the shouting out in the room. It's just not appropriate. And I don't know if the person was overcome by enthusiasm or just didn't realize the boundary. But like when I was little, my brother and I used to like to throw balls in the house. And when we threw balls in the house, like they would sometimes knock stuff over, right? And the response to that with us was we got in big trouble. You know what I mean? So like we would run around and do these crazy things, and basically try not to hit stuff. And if we did hit stuff, we knew basically we're going to get, our asses whooped. And that happened, but what didn't happen was ever the conversation around like, hey, I get it. I know you may have an idea to throw each other the ball in the house. That's perfectly natural to want to throw the ball in the house. Thing is, you can't throw the ball in the house because things can get broken. But let's talk about where you can go to throw the ball. Okay. And, how about outside? How about on the porch, et cetera, et cetera. And I think too often, it's parents not being purposeful about talking to their kids about what is happening, even their thoughts about what's happening. And you got to realize that like children are just like, they're sponges. They're just absorbing, they're looking like, okay, this is happening. This is how the world works. If I'm feeling this way, I need to address it by doing this thing. Or wait, when somebody's angry, what they need to do is scream and yell. When someone's angry, what they need to do is hit somebody. And then when the kid is angry and they get yelled at. Or they, yell, then they get yelled at or hit or whatever. And creates this very strange, just environment, for kids to kind of grow up in. And what's worse about that is it creates the type of environment that doesn't allow people to go outside and discuss what's happening. One, they may not know that it's even strange. Okay. But two, many times, especially when you cross over into like, I think what most of us would say is acceptable is arguing, even loud arguing. Most people would be like, hey, that's pretty normal, even if it's uncomfortable. And goes more into, like rages and hitting or breaking things or storming out and these other things. Kids don't know where to go with that. So they just try to preserve, but they're uploading that as their operating system. They're uploading like, this is how people work. And like, okay, this is how mom responded to how dad did that. And she was okay. So this is how I am to deal with that. But worse is when the kid doesn't actually know how to deal with it. They're not seeing, a success. And what I mean by that is when the family dynamic falls apart, the kid has no place to go, no one to ask. And unfortunately, parents who are in high conflict, they're usually not even able to see past the end of their own nose to even realize this is happening with their kid.
So what does that look like for you in terms of like undoing that? What does that look like to undo some of the damage? What were some of the things that you passed on to your kids, and how have you had to work through that to overcome that?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, in terms of our kids, and I'll just say like, my husband and I, fought a lot, like arguments, like argued a lot. Like one of my kids was sharing with me not too long ago. It's like, we traveled a lot. One of the things we did was we traveled around with the military and we're stationed different places. And so we got into this tradition of going to different countries, and we would stop at McDonald's along the way. And so we would go, the very first time we did it, we went from Germany to France, where we told the kids like, hey, they didn't really want to go. So we told them, hey, there's a McDonald's in France. We'll take you to McDonald's, if you go. So the kids were like super excited. And along the way, we picked up this French flag, and took our first McDonald's picture in front of the, it was like a McDonald's, and it wasn't in Paris, but it was on the way. So that started this whole tradition where we would go to countries. Like when we went to Spain, we actually spent half of our entire trip to Spain looking for a flag so that we could go to the McDonald's and get the second McDonald's picture. And my husband then got real clever about the whole thing and started ordering these flags. But he did. We're like this whole rule. Okay, we're going here. We're going to Croatia. Awesome. We're going to, Italy. Great. So we would order the flags and we would take them along. So we would spend half the trip looking for the flag to do the picture. But, but what one of my kids was saying to me, it's like, I really love that, like, we would take these trips. Like, I really looked forward to it. I mean, we've taken our kids to like 65 countries, but also I dreaded them because you guys would always fight, like in the car or in the hotel or on the way, you know what I mean? Or fight about where we were going to eat or whatever. So half the time we were all like, oh my God, you know what I mean? And I don't know. Honestly, I haven't asked them. And I think this is really probably a good question to ask each of them. Although it's a little weird now that they're adults, if it doesn't kind of organically come up in, conversation. It can be kind of intense when your mom picks up the phone. Hey, when we were traveling when you were a kid, so like, what were you feeling when your dad and I were arguing? Like, weird, like I am feeling now, you know what I mean? Only now I can hang up, bye mom, click, you know what I mean? So, but it's that dread. I mean, it's that whole, like, I love my parents and I want to be with my family and I want to do things with my family, but I hate being trapped in this situation with these two people who are really the center of everything for me, and they're completely out of control. And therefore, I'm not safe. But this is it. This is the only ball game. Honestly, you know, just when I'm describing that, like that, well, one, I know that impacts children's view of God, period. But when I'm thinking this through for myself right now, I remember telling someone at a point in time, you know, like, well, God may not be safe. He may be, like, some people are like, well, if God is good, like, why do these bad things happen? Like, if God is good, why did he create evil? You know, these kind of things. And I was kind of like, hey, I don't know the answer to those questions, but here's the deal. He's the whole ball game. So, you know, what choice do we have but just kind of deal with it? And I do, now that I'm a little older, have some better answers to those questions. Not really the topic of today's conversation, but although we might get into it, I think we could get into it a little bit, but the big thing is that we've got to start to realize not that we are God, but like we are the people that are forming our children's view of the world and, you know, of everything, including God, when we're raising them. Like, we are the center of their world. And our behaviors and what we give them permission to talk about and what we show them is okay becomes their base point of reality. And they take that into their adult relationships and they pass that to their kids, who take that into their adult relationships and they pass that to their kids, and on and on and on. And if you throw into this mix, divorce is an option. You know, like, okay, mommy and daddy just don't love each other anymore. Well, like, why not? Are you going to stop loving me too? You know, like, okay, well, whether I love someone or not is always subject to change. I might love you, and then maybe I won't. You might love me, and then maybe you won't. What kind of insecurity is that you're introducing into a kid's life? Well, no, mommy's always going to love you. Really? So what is it that's so different about me? Because aren't I half daddy?
Wow.
You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's profound. And I mean, that's, again, like, why I'm willing to kind of get in here and, like, you know, share this type of story is because, like, I just don't think we get it as parents, how much of an impact us not being a good steward of our marriage can impact our kids and their kids and their kids. And there is a ripple effect. And I think it's probably because they're not looking backwards enough to see, like, wait just a second. All right, this situation that I've got going on here is an opportunity for a breakthrough. It's an opportunity for a game changer. You know what I mean? Like, I found a person who's my match to bring my stuff up, and I'm their match to bring their stuff up, and we can work on this together if we know that's what we're doing. And instead, you know, we start to fight and keep it in secret, and then we pretend to the neighbors, and then our kids see that we're pretending and everything's false and fake, and they don't know who to talk to about it, or they really just don't have anybody to talk to about it. I think siblings tend to talk with each other. My heart breaks for kids who don't have a sibling to go through this. I had, you know, siblings, and I will tell you, very recently, my mom, my dad, he's my stepdad, but my dad passed several years ago, but my mom had gone into the hospital and had to come out into a rehabilitation hospital afterward. she didn't get rehabilitated enough, truthfully, to go and live on her own. But my siblings and I'm the oldest, I gathered them, to be like, okay, gather the troops. We've got to get mom's house situated so that when she comes home, we can have a wheelchair in here. We can have a walker in here. She can have a hospital bed in her living room so she can live on her own. Ultimately, she wasn't able to do that. She ended up having to, come up here actually to Tennessee and to a assisted living home nearby. But we gathered for that. And it was a time where we sat down. We were going through old family pictures, reminiscing about things, but we sat down in this restaurant in particular and started talking about the things that had happened in our home. And I have, there's kind of like two sets of siblings. My brother and I, the older of my two brothers is just a couple years younger than me. And then I have a sister who's 10 years younger and then a brother who's 13 years younger. So it's almost like two sets of kids. And when we started talking about our experiences in our home and the things that had gone down, and my dad left my mom when I was 16. And so my younger two siblings ended up going and living with him in this step parenting situation. So, and just sharing all the things that had gone on. And, like my younger siblings to a large extent were like, wow, like we didn't know, like mom wasn't like that toward us. My mom was very abusive, physically abusive towards my next younger brother. And that was a huge secret. Although I don't see how it was a secret because everybody freaking knew it. You know what I mean? Like everybody in our family knew it, but it wasn't something like we talked to the pastor or the mailman or the teachers or anything else like that. Corey was just a target. And then in this step family, I found out after my siblings were grown that my youngest brother was a target of the stepmom. So my dad was a constant in both of these households, knowing what his wives were doing to his sons. But I don't know if it was shame. I don't know if it was normative for him. But he never did anything about it. And both of those boys ended up with a lot to work through growing up. And but the similarity actually between me and my sister was that each of us had to carry the shame and burden of not being able to do anything about it. Like, I don't know what my dad's experience was, but I was a kid. What are you going to do? What are you going to do with this kind of a thing going on? So, but even, I can't speak to just whether it has the same impact when you're not in an abusive home. But I will tell you, when I came into adulthood and, my kids' home, I thought, well, none of my kids aren't getting beat. What do you have to complain about? Like, hey, all we're doing is fighting. Well, I'll tell you where I know it led to a lot of anger and a lot of depression and a feeling of not being loved and cared for in my kids. And because we have had those conversations, not, hey, you're fighting in the car caused this, but the whole, I don't feel like I really have a relationship with you. And I'm kind of like, what are you even talking about? Everything I do is for you. Really? Like, do you even really see me? Because, how I ended up feeling like is I'm just here in the background. And honestly, when you're fighting with your spouse, that's exactly where your kids land. Just in the background. They really are.
One of the things that stood out to me when you were saying that is like it's like you had to redevelop a sensitivity to what normal is. What is like, I feel like that's such a huge question of like, how do you even get to what is normal? How do you define normal? How do you get to it? And how do you even know that you need to be resensitized to it in the first place?
Well, and what I think is what I've come to know is like what is normal is it's normal to have conflicts. I don't really know that the goal should be to be normal. Okay. I think what I had to develop a sensitivity to is understanding what's abusive, what's actually not good, not healthy, not okay, and, I don't know if other parents would say this is like, oh, you think you have it rough. When I was a kid, I walked to school uphill both ways in the snow. I mean, and, I didn't say those exact things to my kid, but like, that's the gist of it, right? It's like, oh, you don't know what it's like to have it bad. You don't know what it's like to, oh, you think, whatever. And I think that's really what had to be challenged. Like, hey, just because it doesn't suck as bad for you as it did for me doesn't mean it doesn't suck. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And really, is that the standard? Hey, your life doesn't suck that bad, kid. Like, I never thought, oh, when I grow up, I'll, have a family and my kids' lives will only suck some. You know what I mean? That's not what anybody's dream is, but like, without getting very purposeful, we just recreate a form of what was implanted in us. I think I was mentioning to you, it occurred to me at church yesterday, where it said, and God said, be fruitful and multiply. And from my perspective, and I think, again, this comes down to a principle of I started really thinking about that. And that's exactly what we do. We bear fruit, the fruit of whatever it is that got planted in us. Okay. We can't help it. Like, whatever is planted in us, the fruit is going to come out unless we uproot the stuff that's bearing bad fruit, and the fruit is actually helpful to us. It shows us what's going on down deep inside. We've studied, like in this mastermind that I'm in, what's called belief architecture, where you get in there and that's it. It's like, okay, you've got this thing going on and the thing is just an indication of what's down below, like what's below the surface. And so, you have to get real savvy about recognizing the fruit in your life as an indication of what is really going on with you. And a real big reason I think parents should be particularly interested in this is that you're going to pass it on to your kids. Like, whatever's going on there is being passed on to your kids. I mean, we've all heard, like dad comes home, had a bad day at work, yells at the wife who, swats at the kid who goes and kicks the dog. It rolls downhill in that way. And so, it's critically important to start, dealing with that stuff. And the way that we deal with it is we start, recognize it's a problem, but to start talking about it. Stop acting like it is abnormal to have problems. And I'm not suggesting the next time you get into a fight when you have couples coming over, you turn the whole thing into, a couples therapy session or something like that. What I am suggesting is to cultivate places and relationships where you can have honest conversations with people who are constructive, who, like, for instance, if I have a friend who loves my husband, and if I were to call my friend and say, girl, he, this and this and that, same old, and I can't even, she would be like, you sounds frustrating. Yes, I hear you. Yeah, it sounds like you wanted him to, hear you when you were talking about that. Okay. All right. Now, what about you? Yeah. Okay. That's a real friend. Okay. And if you don't have it in a friend, I'm lucky that I have a friend who has lots and lots of experience with families and, children and adopted children, and was a social worker and all of these types of things. But if you don't have that in a friend, to, have that in a therapist, someone who's not just going to help escalate things between you and your spouse. Mm-hmm. So
could you tell us about when you realized and found out, and maybe had the thought of, maybe I'm not as good of a parent as I thought. When did that moment pop up? And then what were the conversations? How did you have to address that?
Bro, it was like day one. And I think this isn't something that people talk about either. Like, I held this kid and I always thought, okay, cause I was the oldest kid. I thought, I'm going to know. I know how to take care of a kid. I know how to change diapers. I know how to do the things. It is a whole different experience to have a little person be completely dependent on you. And you feel overwhelmed, and at least I did. I felt overwhelmed and not up to the task. And so I'm 20, I'm looking to my 21-year-old husband, we had some arguments before that. That's when the fights really started between us, because we're both now, this kid's dependent on us. And we are trying to figure it out, but also expecting the other person to get on board either with what we've come up to or come up with an answer that we don't have. And, I will tell you, most of the married couples that I know, once they have a kid, then I thought being married was hard until I had a kid. And it's not that they don't love their kid. It is that they do love their kid. But what ends up happening, the kid ends up getting lost in the conflict. They end up getting lost in the sauce. That's, I think, probably where the don't throw the baby out with the bathwater saying probably came from, now that I'm thinking about it. Because you can be so concerned about getting it right and being heard and having things go your way and this, that, and the other. The whole reason that, you even care about it is over there on the sidelines, chopped liver. I don't know. I felt that way when my parents were arguing. In fact, I think my brother and I kind of they're arguing. I can just go do whatever we want. You know what I mean? So I'm just you're invisible. You're literally invisible, in those situations, and I don't know a person on the face of the planet that, wants to feel invisible. Now, a thing I have seen also that happens with kids, and this is not from personal experience, but from dealing with divorce clients, I've seen kids actually used as pawns between their parents, pitted against the other. And kids are really manipulative in that, can get real manipulative, and they're pander to the one and they pander to the other. Can even be alienated, from one parent or another, but that's survival. It's a survival mechanism in the kid. And so if you're seeing your kids do those kinds of things, manipulate or becoming excessively angry with another parent or whatever, you're doing it. And I'll just tell you, if you're a person whose kid is so angry with their other parent that they won't see them, you're fostering that. You have cultivated in that kid, and it is extraordinarily damaging for the child. Are you getting back at the other parent? Yeah, but at the cost of your kid's heart and mental health. You're doing those things because kids need to have healthy relationships with both of their parents, in order to be okay. And I get it. some ex-parents are drug addicts or, never show up or were abusers or what have you. But I think if you really start to look at the person with the eyes of compassion that they deserve, even if they're your ex, that they're, a person who didn't come to that point out of nowhere. They came probably from a system where they were abused, or there was addiction in their family, who probably came from two systems where that abuse and addiction took place, and then other systems, and it just goes so on and so on and so on. And so rather than perpetuate that cycle of abuse into your children by villainizing the other parent, you do much bigger favor by dealing with your own stuff and giving your kid the life tools to be able to, understand that people are not the sum total of the things they do or don't do, but they're a person of infinite worth. We all make mistakes, and, some mistakes have consequences that cause separation, but that their parent was someone that was lovable, that you loved enough to make the kid, and they may be struggling right now, but they're inherently valuable, and so are you.
When did you realize that you talked about you went through your first marriage and it was really rough, and then you had your parents who set one level of standard, and you're like, well, as long as I do better than that, I'm fine. But then your kids were like, no, this standard isn't good either. What did that even look like to have those conversations with your kids?
Okay, so there, in my household, there was abuse, like active physical and verbal abuse going on. In my first marriage, it was a short marriage. There was, when physical abuse, there was verbal abuse, but when physical abuse started, I exited. Okay. And it was rough. It was a very young marriage. I mean, it was a young marriage. We were young, we were dumb. We got married after knowing each other for a very short period of time. And, we really didn't know each other. We didn't spend that time to get to know each other. In my current marriage, which I've been in for almost 30 years now, we took more time to get to know each other, but there were secrets that I wasn't aware of. And these were secrets that had started in my husband's childhood that didn't surface until well into our marriage. And in fact, the secret, like the ultimate, core, we didn't get to the core for decades. We really didn't get to the core for decades. We were so busy fussing about the fruit, fussing about in this loop of conflict. And because I had grown up in a household where there was constant conflict, but there wasn't hitting. The kids weren't being hit. And my husband was providing, for our physical needs. My husband didn't leave us. I was not going to get divorced a second time. For me, that would have been like being a 2-time loser, and so there was a stick-to-itness, and, both my husband and I are very persistent, and I'm very thankful for that. But it was not a Cold War. It was a war going on most of the time throughout our marriage. And it was just the way it was. And so for me, it wasn't like my kids sat around going hey, this really isn't the good standard. It was more that, our kids wouldn't invite people over because they didn't know if we would be arguing, we didn't end up going on trips usually more than once with another family because we would end up arguing, and people didn't want to be around that. And so, and then just other things as my kids came into their teens, it was more, I'm feeling this way, I'm feeling that way. And it was in working through that, I started to realize I felt inadequate as a parent most of the time, but I didn't know what to do about it. I felt inadequate in my marriage most of the time. I just didn't know what to do. I was trying to survive. And so what I'm trying to impart is, like, I get what it's like to be in survival mode, but the collateral damage when you're in survival mode is your kids, and they've got nowhere to go. You think you don't have tools? They really don't have tools. You think you don't have anybody to talk to? They really don't have anybody to talk to. Okay? And even if you figure it out, they're carrying this stuff forward. So my encouragement is, like, to understand that, like, you've got to press in to your own stuff. Like, because what's going on, and you going back to this word normal, it is normal to bring your triggers, your traumas, even little t traumas, into your marital relationship. You're going to do it. Your spouse is going to do it. And the more time and attention that you spend with each other working to help heal from those things, then the better off you're going to be, and you're going to break off the generational curse. What I see happens most often, though, is that people will get into marriages, and instead of taking emotional off-ramps, they take divorce as an off-ramp. And all that does, it's kind of like, have you ever heard the difference between guilt and shame?
I think I would know it, but it's not like fresh in my head right now.
Well, okay. So guilt is feeling regret or remorse for something you have done. Okay. Shame is feeling regret or remorse for who you are. Okay. And when you've done something and wrong, okay, that you feel regret or remorse for, and you have no means to make it right, it becomes shame. Okay. There's no way out, like, I had a friendship where, we got into, an argument, and they went on like full silent mode. Okay. So there's no real avenue to, repent, so to speak, like to go and say, hey, when I said these things, I know it was hurtful to you. I am sorry. And to ask them, will you forgive me? Okay. So that leaves an open loop of shame for me around this friendship. And that person, fortunately for me, I don't always have to just go to people to get forgiveness. I have faith that allows me to go to God to seek forgiveness, and I have a trust that God will mend that person's heart, will deal with that situation if they're not open to it. But I have a responsibility, to try to make amends when I've done someone wrong, to give them that opportunity to close and forgive as well, because otherwise we leave these open heart wounds, right? But the same kind of thing happens with divorce, okay? It's that you cut off an ability for a person to ever move from feeling guilt and remorse for what they've done, and instead you transfer it into an open loop of feeling maybe guilt, maybe remorse for who they are. They weren't a good husband. They weren't a good wife. You understand what I'm saying? They were a failure in your marriage. They let you down. Now, most people who get divorced don't have enough, I think, and it's probably going to piss some people off. They don't have enough like self-awareness to actually get connected with the fact that they have open shame loops connected to the former relationship. And that's mostly because we have defense mechanisms like, like we were telling you there before, like, hey, when I'm feeling some kind of way, then I get into contempt, criticism, you know what I mean, et cetera. And, so they end up blaming it, blaming on their ex-spouse, blaming on the rain. It ain't them. You know what I mean? And that, again, it's a survival mechanism, but it shows up like wherever you go, there you are. And I'm telling you, because I've seen this stuff, I've got, I've even got 3 Pete's in my office. Like where I told him going into the third one, get a prenup for real. I know you're a lover, not a fighter. And we'll see you again. You know what I mean? Because when the stuff hits the fan, I'm going back in. And if you don't change your programming, okay, it is that version, that 1.0 version of who you are is going into the next situation, and you're taking your kids into that as well. And the same thing goes, like your kids are now with two parents who couldn't figure it out. And I'm not saying like that you should get into it if you already are divorced, or if you've got to a point where it's like, hey, look, I did everything that I could on my part and my partner wasn't willing. That happens. You know what I mean? But if you don't close those loops, like, hey, what I did was a bad thing, or what I didn't do was a bad thing. You know what I mean? And there's grace for that. I know better. I'm doing better, etc. And you leave those loops open instead, then you're going to carry that in. And people who are shame-based are unhealthy individuals who hurt other people, knowingly or unknowingly.
And what does it look like to have certain conversations with your kids? Like they come to you like, hey mom, here's an issue. What does it look like on your end? Like what's the process you have to go through as a parent? Cause I'm sure that's not easy. Like you're having to go through a process of humility and making things right. What does that practically look like? I
think a lot of my conversations with my kids had actually happened in the past. Like when I started to, understand, like I've had conversations with my kids about, they're much more, I guess, neutral. I don't know if neutral, but I think less charged topics than you might think. Like with my daughter, she's talking and I'm distracted. And I realize that I have to say, look, I'm sorry, you were talking. I zoned out. You're very important to me. I want to spend time with you. And would you please tell me that again? It's those types of things that end up taking place. Or, I know one conversation that we had, and this was actually one of our kids calling us, because we had argued so much as kids that when he was a kid, he, became very angry and very justified. He felt very justified in his anger. And I would say, yes, his anger was legitimate. He had legitimate reasons to feel angry, right? But he had let it set in with him as a justification for being disrespectful toward us. And so he called one day and said, like, Mom, Dad, I want to tell you that I have been disrespectful towards you. I haven't listened when you talked, or I've dismissed the things that you've said, because, I was angry. I was angry about, the things that went on when I was coming up, and I want to ask you to forgive me. And like for us, we were kind of like, yeah, definitely we forgive you. But I don't think that we had realized the depth to which he was suffering and struggling with feeling angry toward us. So this was internal work that he had to do, that our job, especially as adult parents, was to be ready to hear and to, extend the forgiveness. Because, if we weren't in that place, he could have been like, hey, I was disrespectful as a kid. Yeah, you sure were. Oh, I'm glad you finally figured that out. You know what I mean? Oh yeah, I'll forgive you. Well, maybe I won't forgive you because you know what? You've never given me my due. Do you understand what I mean? It's like for us, that would be super weird. But, I can imagine situations where, if you want to have a better relationship with someone, if you want to come to them and apologize, like I was saying, that open loop with my friend, look, in retrospect, I could have been way more charitable. In retrospect, I should have realized that was not good timing on telling you about yourself. Didn't really say it in a super nice way either. Could have been a lot more gentle and caring about the way that message was delivered, even if it was true, so to speak. But, you know, if I don't feel safe, if I don't have a open door to that, or if I try to step through that door, you know, once and, you know, there's hurt, you know, that's heaps like insult added to injury, then I'm probably not going to step through that door again. And again, that's something that keeps people in bondage. So
it's really good. You got anything? No? You got any closing thoughts or any other like advice for people on this subject or other lessons you're learning along the way?
Well, I mean, I'm not a super expert on it, but I will say that, you know, the secrets that keeping your family shame to yourself or your struggles to yourself is exacting a toll. It's exacting a toll on you, but if you have kids, it's exacting a bigger toll on them. So things that are, you know, kept in the dark grow. And the way to, you know, get freedom for yourself and the way to get healthy for your kids is to bring it out into the light. So talk to somebody about what you're going through, find safe people to work through your issues with. And you and your kids will be way the happier and healthier for it.